Jonathan Kay recently published an article in the National Post on the whole issue of Canadian identity and Canadian cultural and political elites and their attitude toward Canada. And the gist of his argument was that sort of bad-mouthing Canada, hating Canada, criticizing Canada as a construct, as a sort of engine of oppression and so forth has become very trendy, and Kay felt that this was wrong, and he wrote a quite lengthy treatise on this topic. Now, I thought that there were problems with the article. He tended to lump what he calls the left altogether, as if Justin Trudeau and the people protesting the Wet'suwet'en and the people protesting with them are all of the same mindset, and of course they aren't. Uh, the people who are supporting Indigenous causes and Indigenous activists themselves are extremely critical of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party. So there was that incoherence, which Kay did not successfully deal with. However, he did make one point which I thought was very, very interesting, and that was about the Canadian publishing scene. And what he argued was that because statistics show that sales of books by Canadian writers that are published by Canadian houses are falling very precipitously. And recall that the sales of Canadian published books have never been that great in the first place. Canadian books and magazines only represent, historically, have only represented 25% of the market, at least in English Canada, of total magazine and book sales. In other words, practically everything that we buy has historically always been American or British. In Quebec, it's different. There's the hegemony of continental French culture, but hopefully the statistics of small I Indigenous Quebecois books are a little bit healthier in Quebec, although it is a small market and still hard for writers over there. And of course, Indigenous writers themselves have always had a hard go of it, dealing with the sort of patronizing liberalism of Canadian editors and agents, and often being sidelined when they're not considered sort of marketable enough and so forth. There have been some quite interesting examples of that. For example, Richard Wagamese, who was pretty much ignored most of his career and was suddenly embraced at the very end or after his death. Canadians are very good at that, sort of loving the dead, but they could hurry up a little bit. Now, what Kay wanted to say about Canadian publishing is that now, statistically, that 25% figure has fallen by half to 12.5%. And he made the remark that before nations basically disintegrate, their culture kind of falls apart. And I thought that was a point that really should be discussed and taken seriously, because there is something going wrong with culture in Canada, and paradoxically, it's not because there aren't enough writers and artists and filmmakers around. As Russell Smith pointed out a few years ago, Canadians are a very artistic people. There's a lot of creative energy out there, but publishers, for a variety of reasons, have trouble selling books, and it's the same thing. It's ditto for Canadian filmmakers trying to get into theaters, Canadian TV scriptwriters and directors wanting to get their work taken up by Canadian broadcasters, etc. So what is one to do about this situation? I think the first thing that one has to do is discuss it. Now, the framework that this discussion has usually taken place in in English Canada has been within the framework of Canadian nationalism, and there's been some very good writing on the topic over the years by people like Rick Salutin and Brian Fawcett and Stephen Hennigan. And all of them have underlined that there is, first of all, there are systemic problems in terms of Canadian creatives getting their work to audiences. And there is a kind of, I don't know how to put it, but a kind of institutional blind spot in terms of the seriousness of the problem. In other words, the problem is not really addressed. And I felt that Kay himself might, if he goes back to this topic, might consider talking more explicitly about the hegemonic reality of American culture in Canada. And of course, with Lettres Québécois, it's a different issue. Quebecois writers are effectively so alienated from English Canada by this point that culturally they have separated. I mean, as far as they're concerned, there are two cultural countries in Canada, Quebec and Canada. Canada for them just means Anglo-Canada. And among Indigenous writers, this sort of sense of national self-consciousness, consciousness raising is starting to grow. And that's just reality. These are trends that are not going to change. We might as well just accept them graciously. But at the same time, we do need to talk realistically about why Canadian publishing has so much trouble attracting audiences.